It looks like God might be using the women in John Paul Miller's life to expose his deviant behavior to the world. In the meantime, the troubled pastor of the church, called Solid Rock at Market Common in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, is bragging about his plans to bring lawsuits against everyone to help him become a millionaire. According to new court documents obtained by Fitz News, that are nearly 70 pages long, John Paul's ex-wife, Alison Williams, is spilling the horrid details of her horrible marriage to the husband from hell, as well as what Micah Miller had to endure whilst married to him. Stay tuned for shocking accusations of John Paul blaming his own abusive dad for his disgusting behavior towards women, and we'll take a look at the new lady in John Paul's life, who recently was spotted at the beach with him. The first wife, Alison, in Alison's new affidavit, she jumps right into the problems of her marriage to John Paul that came to a head in 2015, including his affair with Micah, who was their former nanny. Alison said John Paul also confessed that in addition to his affair with Micah, he had employed prostitutes and been sexually inappropriate with several underage female members of our church, she wrote. He blamed his immoral sexual behaviors on the sexual abuse he experienced for years by his father, Wayne Miller. The church requested that John Paul enroll in an extensive sexual addiction program, however. Despite him promising Alison that he would, to her knowledge, that never happened. According to the court case named Alison Miller versus John Paul Miller, the couple divorced on September 14, 2016, after approximately 16 years of marriage. Alison and John Paul were married on February 26th, presumably in the year 2000, at Cathedral Baptist Church in Myrtle Beach. The Reverend R.W. Miller performed the ceremony with those mysterious initials standing for Reginald Wayne Miller. According to the scandalous legacy of Reverend Reginald Wayne Miller by Fitz News, John Paul's dad made advances towards young male and female students at Gloryland Bible College. In 1993, the elder Miller attempted to leave these bad optics behind when his family, the church, and the college relocated to Myrtle Beach with a new and improved vision for his ministry. But those generational curses would follow the Miller men, even as John Paul launched Solid Rock Ministries in 2006, while R.W. Miller would go on to be arrested for exposing himself to an undercover officer and end up losing both of his wives to divorce amid accusations of employing Pakistan students basically as slave labor. John Paul followed in his dad's troubling footsteps, soon losing both of his wives as well. The first to divorce, and the second wife, Micah Miller, to a mysterious death that John Paul called self-induced less than 24 hours after it occurred. And now Alison Williams, formerly Alison Miller, filed an explosive verified complaint against her ex-husband, John Paul, a modification of custody, child support, and alimony, dated May 28, 2024 in Horry County. That's because Alison and John Paul have 4 children together, 2 of whom are still minor children, around 14 and 15 years of age. Alison says that John Paul has exhibited increasingly unstable behaviors, hasn't given the kids a safe and stable environment, and exposed the kids to domestic dispute incidents and discord which have been traumatic to them. Alison wants sole and permanent custody of the minor children. The explosive part includes the section wherein Alison asserts that John Paul has failed to seek treatment for his deviant sexual addictions and behaviors, which he admittedly confessed to both Alison and former elders of his church. Alison believes that John Paul has continued to engage in deviant sexual behaviors and has exposed their minor children to an immoral and unsafe environment. Alison also believes John Paul exposed their minor children to his adulterous misconduct with his paramour, a woman who is not named in this section of the court document. Alison says that prior to Micah's death, Micah confided in Alison, sharing intimate details regarding John Paul's bad behavior. Oddly enough, Micah, who was once John Paul and Alison's nanny and the girl that John Paul groomed from a young age, who eventually became his second wife, would end up being a safety net for the children during the times they visited their dad. However, due to Micah's recent tragic death, Micah can no longer be the safety net that Alison needs during their dad's visitation times with the kids. Alison is also requesting that the children not be exposed to their paternal grandfather, Wayne Miller, in any capacity permanently. Therefore, presiding family court judge Sally Wall ordered on May 29, 2024, that Alison shall be granted custody of the minor children and suspended John Paul's visitation with his children until further order of the court. Nobody would believe me, Alison was told by cops. The affair between John Paul and Micah tore our personal and church family apart, Alison wrote. It caused an imaginable amount of pain, says the court document, I guess daring us to imagine the pain. It caused discord in the lives of so many innocent people who truly trusted and believed in John Paul. I guess that's why we can't put too much trust and faith in any human being. Reminds me of when Jesus said, "And call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father, which is in heaven." Alison said that at the time the church learned about John Paul's affair with Micah, the church was operating under the belief the old bylaws had been amended and that they were operating under new bylaws John Paul represented had been put in place, which required the formation of a board of council members to approve any major decisions regarding the church, including financial expenditures. When the council voted to have John Paul temporarily step down from the head pastor position so he could seek treatment for his self-reported sexual addictions and focus on his restoration, instead of following the direction of church leaders, John Paul held a meeting and told the council that the new bylaws were invalid and that according to the old bylaws, he had 100% decision-making authority. That was the first time members of our church had an opportunity to see John Paul for who he really was, Alison wrote, and they became gravely concerned about his integrity and the financial structure of the church. As a result, almost our entire congregation left the church, and John Paul began his quest to recruit new members and operate Solid Rock Ministries solely at his direction. What Alison is talking about is called a church split, when something divides a church. Some folks stay, some don't. It seems that the ill-gotten evil power John Paul had in that town, and even over that police force, outweighed seeking justice for his victims. He could have been arrested years ago, but his ex-wife's cries fell on deaf ears, and she was labeled by law enforcement as a scorned, unbelievable, bitter woman. Alison continued, writing after John Paul informed me that he had been inappropriate with minor female members of our church and disclosed to me the identity of these girls. I immediately contacted them to encourage them to come forward. Although they each shared with me detailed accounts of what John Paul did to them, they were too afraid of John Paul, I guess the document says there, to make a police report or testify in court. When I learned that they were too fearful to report John Paul, I went to the police department for the purpose of making a report and requesting an investigation. However, I was in essence told by police officials that nobody would believe me because John Paul was a well-known pastor and we were in the middle of a divorce. Without the testimony of the victims, there was little else I could do to prove what John Paul had done and ensure he was held accountable. I began to realize the power John Paul seemed to have over leaders and officials in our community. Based upon having limited proof, there was no way for me to ensure John Paul was held accountable and prevented from continuing to victimize innocent people. Given the circumstances, I decided the best way for me to protect our children was to reach an agreement with John Paul that contained terms I believed would ensure their safety and encourage him to seek treatment. To that end, John Paul had periodic periods of visitation with our children. However, we agreed John Paul's visitation with our daughter, who is a subject to this action, would be restricted to solely daytime periods of visitation. The second wife, Micah. Alison began to paint a picture of John Paul's marriage to Micah. She wrote, "Following my divorce from John Paul, he married his then paramour, Micah Miller. Prior to my knowledge of John Paul's sexual relationship with Micah during our marriage, both she and her husband at the time, Jeremy, became very close to our family. Micah did not have a close relationship with her mother, and to some degree I took her under my wing as an older daughter. I taught her to drive, took her to get her driver's license, allowed her to care for our children, shared family meal times together in our home, provided her guidance and advice, and she began working in the church. Despite the initial destruction caused by John Paul's infidelity for several years, there was a part of me that was relieved to know Micah would be present in the home when John Paul had periods of visitation with our children, and I viewed her as a safety net for my children. Although our children continued to struggle with the anger and disappointment they felt toward their father, often refusing to share visitation periods with him, for a couple of years, things appeared to be not quite as tumultuous.
Kiss your bride!
There were probably many nights that Micah had wished she had remained married to Jeremy and never fell for the demonic advances of John Paul, the so-called man of God who officiated their wedding. Instead, after stealing Micah away from her husband, John Paul turned into a downward sliding deviant who now wants to be a millionaire via lawsuits. In her affidavit, Alison would go on to describe how the marriage between John Paul and Micah began to go downhill about 4 or 5 years after they married in 2017, and how that marital discord severely impacted their blended family. She wrote, "In 2021 to 2022, things gradually began to change to the detriment of our children and have escalated to the severity of where things are today. John Paul and Micah began having severe marital difficulties, and our children were placed directly in the middle of this discord. John Paul would preach sermons on the Sundays our children were with him and present in the congregation, disparaging Micah and indicating she had mental health issues, and eventually putting her in a mental hospital. The children were subjected to John Paul calling Micah crazy one day, and then her being back in the home at their next visit with their father, assuring them she was fine. They never knew what to expect, and the intense unpredictability and marital discord between John Paul and Micah negatively impacted them all. On one occasion, while picking up our daughter, I observed holes in their walls, hinges off the doors, and pieces of paper taped to the wall with negative affirmations about Micah. John Paul told me and our children that Micah was delusional and speaking different languages and seeing things that were not there. John Paul agreed it was not safe for our children to be in his home, and for health struggles, the thought of John Paul having access to guns in his home terrified me for the safety of our children. It was about this time John Paul began declining to pick up our children for visitation, informing me that his mental health was not well enough for him to share time with them. One evening, John Paul informed me that Micah had a breakdown and was on her way to my house, and requested me to hold her when she arrived because he had the police coming. It was my understanding that Micah was trying to get away from John Paul because he was trying to have her committed again. Micah began calling me for advice on how to free herself from John Paul and for guidance as to counselors and people to assist her. I prayed with Micah and did all I could to provide her with sound advice and guidance. Micah shared information with me about the things my children were exposed to while in the care of John Paul and warned me that my children were in danger while in his care. I have several recordings and text messages that verify this information. I was married to John Paul for 16 years. Although my story and what I lived through with John Paul is different in some ways, many of the details shared with me by Micah are so similar to my own experiences with John Paul that I know she was being truthful. Based upon information and belief, John Paul's mental health and deviant sexual addictions have only worsened since the time we were married, and I do not believe our children are safe in his care. Since Micah's death, I have requested that John Paul not see our children. Initially, I was okay with phone calls and text messages. However, when recently texting with them, John Paul has inappropriately discussed the current state of events with them, among other things, sharing his plans of suing everyone and being a millionaire. There it is. So now we all know what was behind that stupid blanket cease and desist letter that John Paul's attorney sent to the entire world. Instead of simply grieving the tragic death of Micah and attempting to improve his fractured relationship with his children and getting serious help to exorcise his own demons, John Paul is thinking of launching frivolous lawsuits in order to grift his next millions. I guess John Paul thinks he needs a lot of money to entertain the new potential next wives in his life. But is the Lord telling John Paul enough is enough? Will the feds be able to arrest John Paul for anything? And Alison is clear in that she's not punishing John Paul and trying to keep his kids away from him forever, just only until he seriously seeks help to change his dangerous behavior. Check the links below to Fitz News to find the PDFs that contain much more information from Alison, who came to the court with all the receipts of stuff she's been screaming from the hilltops for years. Alison has evidence of a flash drive containing videos of John Paul's minor child fighting against going to visit him and a voicemail from Micah seeking help as evidence of severe emotional turmoil with John Paul. Even Micah's mother texted Alison seeking help. It was a Saturday at 3 a.m. when Micah's mother wrote, "Allie, I'm begging you as one mother to another. Please talk to me. I love you. I pray for you often. Please call me. Please. I promise that no one will know we spoke. I'm concerned for the safety of my daughter." And then 29 minutes later, Micah's mom wrote, "I'm begging you, not to let JP know I've reached out to you. He will just further isolate Micah from us. Please." There are group text messages between Micah, Alison, and John Paul, trying to get Alison to break her no overnight provision with their daughter and confiding the reason for restraint. So did John Paul do something to his own daughter for Alison to implement this policy? Either way, I applaud Alison for protecting her children. Alison texted John Paul, "Did you tell our daughter she can go on trips with you when she turns 13? John Paul texted back, "What we hope for and what we pray for is that there will be a heart change, seeing as I have never nor will ever hurt one of my kids or put them in any situation that would hurt them. You can continue to say no, and you can continue to think the way you do, but we can continue to pray and hope. We didn't ask you, so there's no need to discuss it. But one day, if or when we do, we would love to discuss it." Alison did not fall for his gaslighting and Christianese talk about a heart change. Instead, Alison replied, "Hey, when you talk about it with our daughter, it absolutely opens the discussion up for all of us. She can't have normal privileges because you have committed terrible crimes of sexually molesting underage children. Praying for my heart to change is absolute gaslighting. When you bring this topic up, or if the children ask, I tell them the truth. I will not cover up and lie. I will continue to tell her the truth in an age-appropriate way. That's nothing a mother wants to discuss, but when asked to, I tell the truth. Sadly, this is reality, and we face it and deal with it. If you don't want this discussed with our daughter, then you shouldn't bring it up, or if she asked and is sad she misses out on vacations and such, maybe you should take ownership and responsibility for your actions, present or past, and own it. Say it's your fault and move forward. If you need or Micah want to discuss this more, let's sit down and talk about it. John Paul replied with a defensive list. 1. This has nothing to do with my own child. 2. The fact that our daughter is with me all the time from morning until night. There's no difference between night to morning. She is with her dad. The time of day has no bearing. Funny how John Paul spelled bearing wrong and instead used the spelling that means to uncover a part of the body or other thing and expose it to view. But you can do as you want. It is evil to remotely make a child think that their parent would ever in a million years hurt them. Alison replied, I don't. I tell her the truth why you legally have lost privileges. John Paul wrote back, the truth isn't that I lost the privilege because of legal mistakes. I don't have the privilege because I signed a paper that you had me sign, but you allowed redacted to stay the night for a while, and you can always allow it if you want to, because there's no difference in her with me in the day, afternoon, night, morning, etc. But again, it's your decision per legal papers. Alison wrote, we can sit down and discuss this more in person. I can show why legal papers were signed. It was to avoid presenting affidavits from the minors you've molested. John Paul wrote, okay, thank you. I love Alison, by the way. She's stating facts, avoiding his BS. It appears Micah then chimed in. If it was really her and wrote, put simply, your son started choosing where he wanted to go at 13, so we assumed your daughter would have that choice as well. Didn't think the gender was the issue, since we get her on a regular basis with no fear of anything happening to her. Didn't mean to make a big fuss and bring up 20-year-old issues. Alison snapped back. Who says there is no fear? This is not a 20-year-old issue. Do you think those victims of his would say it's a 20-year-old issue? Also, John Paul still displays continued poor character and puts our children in harmful situations. Paying someone to take me to lunch to ask me if he leaves you and the church, would I ever remarry him, and being unfaithful to you and putting my child up to be a middleman is a horrible situation to put my child in. Getting a job for someone at a location where their boss was one of his mistresses is a horrible situation to put my children in, especially since she had told a teenage coworker she slept with her pastor before her wedding, and those kids could have told my children, putting my children in harmful situations. Also having someone around some children who was a former inappropriate relationship is also a horrible situation to put my children in. It is selfish and harmful and has no consideration on how it could affect my children and all they have already been put through by him, and honestly, you too. He has shown his interest and scheme at hand are most important by doing those things. This continued lack of character is harmful for all involved, and I will not hide it or pretend all is well when a finger gets pointed at me as though this is a possible misunderstanding or overreaction. I am peaceable but will not tolerate any blame, shifting and gaslighting, intentional or unintentional. John Paul seemed to just write, okay, thanks again, but Micah wrote, no one is pointing the finger at you, saying John Paul's actions are your fault. However, what you heard about someone is not true. I've done my due diligence. As far as blank, I am aware of her transgressions, pics, and John Paul's lack of guts to get rid of her sooner. I hope this won't affect your opinion of her children. Boy, that text string was a doozy. I don't know all the women and victims they are speaking of, and I wonder what year these texts took place. I also wonder if it's Micah really defending John Paul that much, or if he took Micah's phone and wrote those responses himself. Alison even has text messages that purport to have come from the phones of the minor children to Micah, but it was really John Paul pretending to be his own kids, texting Micah, trying to get her to come home. It's very sad to see John Paul writing to Micah under the guise of a kid, claiming in one message string, hey, It's me. When are you coming home? Dad just cries and prays real loud. Micah wrote back, I wish I could come home. John Paul wrote, Dad says you can, anytime. Micah wrote, he says different things to me. I miss you guys very much. I cry too. John Paul wrote, he said he's sorry and it's your birthday. Micah wrote, yep, I'm 30. Just got my toes done at Daisy. Life is going to move on, but it will be really weird for a bit. This must have been March 7th, 2024. John Paul replied, so you're not coming home ever. What can I tell Dad to do so you can come home? I prayed with Dad for you to come home. Micah wrote, thank you for your prayers. Inside, I know he knows what's right, but we have to make choices that line up with that. You're really smart and kind and pretty like your mom. I'll miss you. John Paul wrote, Mom says boys are dumb, but I know Dad loves you a lot. I've never seen him cry so much. He's crying so loud right now. Can you talk to him, please? I promise he loves you. He has your pictures all over the house. He won't do anything with us. He just keeps crying. Micah wrote, last time I tried to come home and be peaceful, he called the cops and said I was trying to break in after he was the one that asked me to come. My hands are tied. He would not even let me in. After more begging from John Paul, Micah explained, he has already filed the paperwork. He is leaving me and trying to make it seem like I left him. I don't think it's healthy for you to get involved. Alison also has messages from John Paul saying Micah moved out so she can hang with her sisters. Other messages say, Micah is officially gone from this house and Solid Rock forever, and divorce agreement is in effect. Please just keep this between us right now. It's very hard on me, and I don't want added stress. I'm just telling you, 'cause it's you. Another text from JP says, by the way, the hole in the bedroom door was Micah, and I have a video of her doing it. So don't worry, I'm not an angry person. Smiley face. Next, John Paul sent Alison a photo of his son's mugshot after Logan Ryan Hardy, JP's son from his first relationship, appeared on WDPE in an article titled, Conway Man Accused of Hitting Women Over Head with Glass Bottle. One last ominous message listed in the PDF is dated March 11th, and it reads, Hey Allie, it's Micah. I need to talk to you ASAP for the safety of your kids. Please call me. You almost free? Micah included a screenshot of the text message exchange of JP pretending to be his child. Alison writes about the other woman, Susie Skinner. Susie is a woman who claimed to be just friends with John Paul. She said that he had no one to go out with to eat dinner after Micah's death, so she went with him. However, JP's ex-wife tells a different, more salacious and sinister story. On page 6 of the affidavit of Alison Williams, in a document linked to below, Alison chimes in on Susie Skinner. She wrote, John Paul began spending time with his now paramour, Susie, who was the mother of one of the boys that plays on our son's soccer team. John Paul began using our son to facilitate times he could spend with Susie, which our children were well aware of. Their friends talked about it, and it caused them a tremendous amount of embarrassment. When I learned John Paul was exposing our children to yet another one of his adulterous affairs, I confronted John Paul and Susie and told them not to let it happen again. John Paul called me the day Susie's husband died in an alleged drowning accident, extremely upset, and asking me to pray, which was incredibly bizarre. Just 2 weeks prior to this incident, Susie's husband had confronted John Paul and asked him to leave his wife and children alone. It is chilling to know that the spouses of both Susie and John Paul are now dead from tragic events. It was around this time John Paul's mental health seemed to be really spiraling out of control, and he began acting even more bizarre. He informed me that he was getting into buying guns and shooting and had purchased a gun safe for his home. As a convicted felon, he is not allowed to have weapons. However, he managed to get a police chief from the church to assist with expunging his record. Further, he was given a special police badge that says pastor to utilize if he ever gets pulled over, so they will let him go. The other new woman. Now, new photos of John Paul at the beach with another woman are going viral. Internet sleuths pretty quickly found out her name, and it appears to be a woman who has attended Solid Rock Church in the past. Of course, it doesn't mean that she's the new lady love in John Paul's life. However, you can expect a man like him to not stay single very long, especially since he's been accused of not being able to have self-control, nor stay faithful very often, even when married to very lovely ladies. And any woman who John Paul dates going forward will likely continue to get just as much attention as he's getting. With the internet on fire, waiting and hoping and praying for Micah to get whatever justice she is due for putting up with his ill treatment of her for so many years. This is a major fork in the road for the Solid Rock Church, whose administrators still proclaim that services are on Sundays at 10 a.m. Reportedly, their attendance is way down. That means their tithes and offerings are likely way down too. What will John Paul do? Will he try to bounce back or start over? Or has the sad death of Micah brought so much attention to all this evil that has been under wraps for years that John Paul's last hope is to fall on the mercy of our Maker? Will John Paul ever repent and change? Or will he try to gaslight God? Perhaps John Paul should drop the lawsuit threats and dreams of being a millionaire and instead study the words of Malachi 2, verses 13 through 17. And this is another thing you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and groaning, because he no longer regards your offerings or receives them gladly from your hands. Yet you ask, why? It is because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have broken faith, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Has not the Lord made them one, having a portion of the Spirit? And why one? Because he seeks godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and do not break faith with the wife of your youth. For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel. He who divorces his wife covers his garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and do not break faith. You have wearied the Lord with your words. Yet you ask, how have we wearied him? By saying, all who do evil are good in the sight of the Lord, and in them he delights. Or, where is the God of justice?